Well, good morning. Good to see you. Good to see those who are with us on Zoom this morning. And here we are for a harvest service, something that's been very traditional in churches over generations. And if you live in Shropshire, there's a very good reason to have a harvest service. There are in this county 3,500 farms, roughly. Some are very small and a few are very large. There are 10,000 farm workers on those farms. And if we add in agricultural chemicals, contractors, food processing, transportation, and a whole number of other support industries, that number of workers might double to 20,000 workers across the county. This is still an agricultural county. And we really want to honor that today. That's one thread of why we're having this service. Now, one of the things I really enjoy doing recreationally is taking my bicycle and heading off into the country. And I'll often have a set route. And one of the things I do along the route is observe the stage of the agricultural process. And if you do that regularly, you go along the same road regularly, maybe you do that in your car, less easy in the car because you're traveling too fast, but when you're on a bike or you're walking, you notice things, don't you? You notice the season changing. You literally see the crops rising up. And in the last month or so, I've had to dodge tractors and other agricultural vehicles. I even got stuck in a traffic jam yesterday down a country road where there were two agricultural vehicles and there was no way past them while they were trying to get past each other. And that only happens at certain times in the season. And so agriculture's very, very important to our community in ways that are hidden, especially from townies like me. I have to go looking for this reality because it isn't there in my face. But it's a very important part of who we are. And of course, we're also a county that's very significantly involved in animal husbandry because there's a higher proportion of grassland in Shropshire than there is in most counties in England. So cattle, dairy, sheep, goats, pigs, all sorts of animals, chickens, everywhere you go, there's animal husbandry going on. And there's about 60% grasslands and somewhere like 40% arable for crops. So this is a really important aspect of just who we are in our community. Some of you are involved in agriculture, and we want to honor you today and thank you for your work. And some of you live in the country, and you feel and see the seasons more closely than people like me do who live in the town. And these are things that God has made and God has given us. But during COVID, there were two really big challenges, two deep experiences that our community had. One was a brief period where there was a risk of food shortage. Do you remember that? And there actually was some food shortage. And this was in the early days of COVID and lockdown when food was rationed and people were rushing to the superstores. Do you remember that period? That was an anxious period for many people. They didn't know what was going on. But another experience that's much more profound than that is that people who a couple of years ago had good jobs, there are some people today who suddenly lost their jobs because of COVID. And they've ended up at food banks. They've ended up in the benefits queue. They've ended up looking for part-time work. They've ended up perhaps in food insecurity. In our county, in our community, in our town, there are people like that who would never imagine that that would have been their reality 2 years ago. But it is today. And that's why to gather food for the food bank is not just a superficial symbol or gesture. It's a representation of community intent. That we support people for whom the access to food is a symbol of their economic vulnerability. It's the frontline symbol. We can't afford the food. That's because of everything else that's happening. And so currently, the food bank, according to statistics that Karen Williams has given us, is supporting on average 100 people a week who are suffering in this way. So these things are connected and they're important. But one thing that I think we often miss is that when we go to the scriptures, when we come to the Bible, agriculture and land is right in the middle of this book, everywhere you go. Land really matters to God. Agriculture is really central to his purposes for humanity. And when Adam was formed and created, the very first job that God gave him to do was to get working with his hands. And when Eve was created, she was coming along to work with him with his hands. That was the very first thing. Work in this area. Look after this land. The very, very hands of the first humans were covered in dirt from the soil. So the connection between man and the soil became intrinsic to everything. And what we often forget is when God said, right, I'm going to choose a particular people, and I'm going to choose these people, I'm going to call them the Israelites. They're going to be the sons of Abraham. One of the most central things he did with them was he said, here is a land. And he did something with those people that no other society has ever done with land, ever. Effectively, the communists tried and failed, but God did something with land that nobody ever done before. When they arrived in their land, this beautiful land of Israel, which is coming up on the screen right now, when they arrived in the land, every single tribe, every single clan, every single family, apart from the priests who had other provision, every single family had some land. No feudal system, no giant landowners, no underpaid workers with insecure tenure. Everybody had some land in Israel. God wanted to show to the world that his people were going to live differently, and the way he did it was through land. So if you came to Israel, it looked and it felt totally different to any other country in the ancient world. If you went to Egypt, you'd see big farms controlled by big landowners with lots of power and lots of money. But in Israel, you saw hundreds and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of little farmers, little families, with their small holdings and their land, with a stake in the land. God's land that he gave to them. And when you read through the Old Testament and you read through the laws, I bet you don't read through the book of Leviticus very often, do you? And you come to these sayings. When you reap the harvest of your land, do not reap to the very edges of your fields or gather the gleanings of your harvest. Do not go over your vineyard a second time or pick up the grapes that have fallen. Leave them for the poor and the foreigner. I am the Lord your God. So every farmer knew that the grain on their fields was to be shared, that they were to leave the edges, because there's always somebody who hasn't got any, someone who's been kicked off their land, someone who's moved in, someone who's a widow, someone who's an orphan, someone who's fallen on hard times. So during harvest they can take something. And it says in here, do not hold back the wages of a hired worker overnight. If you employ somebody on your farm, you can't pay them tomorrow, you've got to pay them this evening, says God. He says, don't plant your field with two kinds of seed, keep them separate. He said, when you plant your fruit trees, let them grow for a few years before you harvest them properly. And he says, use honest scales and honest weights when you're measuring out your wheat and all the other things. This is an agricultural society. God's society was an agricultural society. But they feared three things. War, always a disaster for agriculture. Drought, an ever-present danger in the Middle East. And perhaps worst of all, locusts. In modern-day Israel, the scientists tell us that locusts will swarm in parts of the country every 10 to 15 years, and there are many parts of the Middle East and Africa where the locust swarm is a deadly danger to agriculture and to food production. And what we can also notice in the scriptures, which is very rarely mentioned, Jesus grew up in the most productive agricultural part of Israel, Galilee, the north. Beautiful river coming down from the Lebanese mountains called the Jordan, a beautiful lake, an inland lake, a wonderful, beautiful lake, the Sea of Galilee, thriving with a fishing industry, providing water to the surrounding areas. And so Jesus' family would have had their small holding, they would have had their animals, they were surrounded by shepherds, they were surrounded by small holdings and people growing crops. And so Jesus' whole life was embedded in agriculture. And that's why some of the images of the Christian life, the most powerful images, are agricultural images. They're about plants. They're about the growth cycle. And sometimes we miss them. We hardly notice these images because we're not so well connected to the land. But I'll come back to one or two of those at the end of the talk. So many images from the land. Jesus went round and he could see things, and he could see meaning within them. Now, in our world today, in terms of food and agriculture, all is not well. The world's population is growing fast, heading towards 8 billion. Agriculture is struggling to keep up, and there are huge variations in different parts of the world. And so I'm going to just illustrate to you now with just a little human illustration what's actually going on with food in our world today. If we imagine that there are roughly nearly 8 billion people in the world today, I'm going to ask in a moment some selected volunteers who've already volunteered, I think, to come. I'm going to get 8 people up, and they're going to stand on this staging just below me. And each of these people represents 1 billion human beings. Okay, they don't have to take it personally. They're not trying to represent them in any way other than just being here. I've told them they don't have to do any acting. So I'd like those 8 people, volunteers, to come. They're coming slowly. And I'd like you to stand on the staging here facing that way. Let's see if we got 8. I spoke to a large group and I said I need about 8 within the group. Oh, it's the music group, the worship group. That's pretty good. They might sing you a song. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay. There are 8 billion people in the world. And how much food have they got access to on a regular basis? There are 3 categories. Those people who've got enough food available to them. Those people who are insecure in access to food, and those people who are undernourished or even suffering famine at this time. And out of these 8 billion people, very approximately, according to the best statistics I can find, 5 of these billion people have sufficient food. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. These people are okay. And most of you and me are these people, aren't we? If we go to the shop, the food is there. We're talking about necessities, things we need for our nourishment. We can access them. And most of us, most of the time, have enough money to buy what we need for our families or ourselves. And so we are these 5. But these 2 here, Helen and Meg, are having a harder time in life. You might not know it from their look on the face. But I can tell you, they are the 2 billion of the world's inhabitants who can't be sure that the food is going to be there. There are seasonal variations in their countries and in their regions. Sometimes the shops don't have the food they want. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they've got enough money to buy the food for their families, and sometimes they don't. And that's 2 billion people. And I can't even imagine how many a billion is, except by telling you it's 1 with 9 noughts after it, 1,000 million. It's such a big number that it's hard to imagine. But 2 billion of your fellow human beings cannot be sure every day and every week that there's enough food on the table. And Tim represents 1 billion, don't take it personally, nearly 1 billion people, by the best stats that I can find, and these are approximations, who, as we sit here today, are malnourished, undernourished, or in a state of famine in our world today. So I want you to remember Tim and to remember Helen and Meg more than these 5 here, nice though they are. They're like you and me. But in a service like this, we're using our imagination to get into the big wide world, and we're realizing all is not well. Population is growing, agriculture is under pressure, water supplies are a real difficulty in some areas, and the world is under pressure with regard to food. Thank you very much to those 8. Let's show them our appreciation. And all is not well for another reason. And that's because our climate is changing in the world through the process of what's known as the greenhouse effect, which is coming up on the screen now very simply. Through the production of certain gases, particularly carbon dioxide, there's also methane and nitrogen oxide, but carbon dioxide is the big driver of this, that we're producing in large numbers, and we know all about this. The Earth's atmosphere is heating up because, like a greenhouse, those gases operate like the glass in a greenhouse. You know what it's like standing in a greenhouse, and it's awfully hot in the greenhouse, and it's not half as hot outside, and you can't work out why. That's because the glass retains the radiation of the sun to a high level, and so do these gases. And so the temperature of the Earth is just building up very slowly but surely. And the impact of this, and the only reason to mention it here, is that this has big effects on agriculture. There's many other effects, but let's just focus on one thing. Agriculture is under pressure because the rainfall cycle is less predictable and more intense. And that gets more extreme the nearer the equator you get. And the poorer countries of the world are nearer the equator. And so they are experiencing, countries like Kenya, Fred and Esther are here from Kenya. And I've spoken to people in Kenya, and I've spoken to people in Zambia and different parts of Africa, and I've spoken to people from all sorts of different places. Wherever I travel, and I ask them, tell me about the rainfall cycle. It's my number one question when I go to a tropical country, and almost everybody says it's changing. It's changing. It's not so sure. Drought is, the rainfall, it's unpredictable. So this is now undermining agriculture, which is why this issue of climate change really matters. And this talk isn't about climate change, but there are some resources that I will guide you towards if you're interested in this. I've done a seminar on this recently. You can get details from the office. And there's some other things you can find on the welcome desk or in the notices. I'm doing a day of teaching with Dr. Ruth Valerio from Tearfund on this issue in October, which you can access online. You can go to Tearfund and find out lots of information. It's all in the notices or on the welcome desk if you want to follow any of that up. So harvest has many implications. And we are in a position of astonishing blessing. Can we just affirm this in our worship today? We live in a rich country. We live in a productive country. We live in a country whose agriculture is highly developed and very productive when you compare it with many parts of the world. We have an incredible food supply chain. We have incredible access to food that we need. And it becomes so much part of our experience that we take it for granted. And the point of this talk is to step back from our lived experience and think about these other people in the world. Think about those 3 people I mentioned over here who are not so sure they've got the food they need, or they definitely haven't got the food they need. And their parents who are deeply anxious about their children because they cannot feed them. And this is very hard for us to imagine. But we need to imagine this if we're going to engage creatively. And one thing we can do is we can give to those people we can help. And some of those people are here. They're in our town. And we have a way of helping them. And that's why this collection of food matters. And we're grateful for it. Because it's a sign of a commitment of our church not to forget those whose economic situation makes the supply of food, amongst many other things, a real, practical, daily challenge. Now, coming back to ourselves, Jesus used so many metaphors from the natural world. And here's 1 or 2, just as we conclude. I want to now think about ourselves and our own growth and development as individuals, as Christians, or maybe you're not a believer yet and you're just looking in. That's great, you've come to the right place. But Jesus said in John chapter 12 something which I've thought about a lot. And it's about a seed. Jesus replied, "The hour has come for the Son of Man to be glorified." That's a reference to his crucifixion. And the next bit's interesting. "Very truly I tell you, unless a kernel of wheat or a seed of wheat falls to the ground and dies, it remains only a single seed. But if it dies, it produces many seeds." And he said that as he was about to die. And there's something about Christianity where your life is like a seed. You control it. It belongs to you. It's a resource you have. You can keep it. You can control it. You can maintain control over that seed for the rest of your life, or you can take the ultimate risk, which is to believe in Jesus, to follow him, to put your trust in him, which is like putting the seed into the ground, because the moment you do that, you've lost sight of the seed, you've lost control of the seed, and you have no guarantees as to what the outcome will be. And we all know that when we plant seeds in the garden or farmers plant seeds in their fields. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't control the outcome. We can manipulate it, but we can't control it. But just as the farmer takes the risk, sowing rather than keeping to eat, so it's a risk to give your life wholly to Jesus. But the tragedy is if you don't, you end up at the end of your life, you've just got the one seed, and it becomes valueless at that point. Whereas if you've sown your seed, you invested it in the kingdom, you never know how God might use that. You never know what influence you may have. You never know how he'll multiply his grace through you. And so we have to take the risk. Now, while I was preparing this talk, I was just pondering a few of these biblical metaphors, and I suddenly thought of something else that Jesus said, which is where I want to finish today. Do you remember Jesus in John 15 spoke about a vine? "I am the true vine, and my Father is the gardener. He cuts off every branch in me that bears no fruit, while every branch that does bear fruit he prunes, so that it will be even more fruitful. Here's another way of thinking about our Christian lives. Now, in order to illustrate this, I've brought in something which I daren't show the stewards at the beginning, so I hid it in my bag, hoping that the metal detectors wouldn't find it. This is for pruning. Okay, this is what I use at home. Okay. And I brought it with me because I just want to illustrate this for you. So Jane and I, we prune what we have. We're not fantastic gardeners, but we do our best. And some years ago, I planted a Virginia creeper. And I created a trellis to go along a fence. There was a boring fence, and I thought, we don't want a boring fence there. Let's have something interesting. Someone said, why don't you plant a Virginia creeper? I didn't know what I was doing, so off we went. And I looked at it this morning, and it's in the height of its beauty, because it's just coming up to when its beautiful green leaves go the autumn shade. And for a few weeks, it just sparkles with beauty and color, and then it declines rapidly. But as I looked at it this morning, there was a little bit of pride in me about what I'd achieved. I have to admit that. But then I thought about pruning. So this is an energetic Virginia creeper, and during the summer, during the growing months, every week, these are in action. Clipping off, it's going off in this direction, it's going off in that direction, it's going off in the other direction. We need to train it along the fence. It's going over into the neighbor's garden, which it does regularly. It seems to like the neighbor's garden for some reason, so I've got to stop it doing that. So every week, I'm pruning it. My Father is the gardener. My Father is the gardener. So all the time, my Father's shaping my life by circumstances, good and bad, guidance, the discipline of being in a church, worshiping God, the Word of God, the challenge of other people, prayer, circumstances, difficulties, illnesses, opportunities, shaping me. Just like I'm shaping my Virginia creeper. And then comes the end of the season, where every year I'm faced with a choice. Do I give it a really drastic haircut and take it even down to the root, which I've done some years? Or do I just trim back some of the branches? But whichever I do, it's quite drastic. And every time I do it, and especially if I do the severe one, I think, will it survive? And I eagerly wait in the spring to see whether it's coming up again. So far, so good. But you never know when it comes to the end of the road. But our Father shapes our lives on a daily basis. But sometimes a radical thing happens where he's pushing things back, he's cutting things back. And it might be because we made a really stupid mistake. It might be something that happened to us which is absolutely not our responsibility at all. It might be something totally random. It might be a prophecy that comes to us to move in a different direction. It could be anything, a drastic circumstance. And in that drastic circumstance, the Father is the gardener. And as I prayed about this, I felt the Lord showing me that in our church, during the last 18 months, there's been a real pruning through a variety of different circumstances. But as I was thinking about it, I felt we're moving into a time now when fruitfulness will come from the pruning. Fruitfulness is coming to this church because of the pruning and the changes. And so in the spring, I go to my Virginia creeper. I don't pray over it or lay hands on it, but it's not far off that. Because there's not many other successes I can speak of in the garden, apart from just cutting the grass and the hedge. But I do look at it very carefully. And when it starts growing, boy, does it grow. It grows and it grows and it grows really fast. And I'm back to my weekly trimming again, just to keep it on the right track. And then I remember My Father is the gardener. And he's shaping your life. And some of you, as I'm speaking, will know what those shaping circumstances are. And the Holy Spirit is giving you an interpretation even now of events that have happened to you that you've struggled to understand. And you're getting revelation right now. He's in control. And the ultimate goal is fruitfulness. The Father is a pruner, not a hacker. You know some people who hack through gardens and things just die under their care? He's not like that. He knows how to bring the best out. And that's what he's going to do for us as we follow him. So we worship him today. God of the harvest who provides for us. The God of justice who wants our harvest to be shared with people who've got less than us, as symbolized by these gifts that you've very kindly given this morning. And the God who through, in his people wants us to be productive just like the natural world. And the same principles apply. Sowing, reaping, pruning, growing, the difference of seasons that we experience in the agricultural cycle. Let's have the musicians back. I'd love to sing as we conclude. O Lord my God. Let's sing that again. Let's put the words up, shall we, Matt, while they're preparing.